Okay, I started recording. I would first like to mention at the beginning of this presentation that this research was conducted for the purposes of being a capstone project with the purposes of graduation with university honors. I performed all of this research under my faculty mentor, Dr. Jennifer Syvertson from the Department of Anthropology. So with a title like Witchcraft as a Form of Healing during the COVID-19 pandemic, there are three subsequent forms of background information I think are necessary. The first and most important of which being what exactly is witchcraft in this context. So my personal definition of witchcraft for the purposes of this research is a spiritual practice with the intention to reach a desired outcome. And the intention part is the most important piece, as a spiritual practice and the desired outcome that comes of it can vary per the individual, but it's really at the core a ritual with intention. Then what is healing? I've defined healing for this research as a personalized way to seek improvement in the mind or body. I don't include any specific forms of healing in this definition, as due to inequities in the modern medicine healthcare system, there are many ways that an individual might seek healing that are alternative or complementary to the US healthcare system. So ultimately, healing is just seeking improvement in the mind, body, or emotions. Then why am I interested in this specifically during the COVID-19 pandemic? The pandemic was a unique situation simply because not only did we have a global stressful situation felt by the entire world, we also had an increase in free information access through social media. So in 2020 alone, there were about 700 million new users globally on social media platforms. So when you combine a stressful situation and free information access, the mind tends to open up and consider topics that were considered taboo previously. So more individuals started to open up to the idea of using witchcraft in an application to healing. So within these three ideas, I ultimately wanted to understand exactly how all three of these interact with each other, the how and the why. How is witchcraft used as a form of healing, and why was it employed during the COVID-19 pandemic specifically? There was previous anthropological research done on ritual and witchcraft healing applications, but not in the context of the pandemic, likely due to the short time frame, but I would like to add that context to the conversation. So I expect for the how, I expect to hear a lot of conversations on mental and emotional healing specifically, rather than physical. And for the why, I expected to hear conversations, like I previously mentioned, on inequitable access to modern healthcare and needing to cope with the stress of being in a global pandemic. So how I went about this research was a two-step process. I performed participant observation with online social media content oriented around witchcraft healing. So I chose 3 videos on YouTube that were created between the dates of March 2020 to August 2021, really the peak of the pandemic and the lockdown period. And I chose 3 videos that were engaged with well. The viewing rates were high, the commenting rates were high, and I actually participated by executing the rituals that were described in those videos so that I shared an experience with those in the comments and I can understand what the receptions were on a social media platform. Secondly, I conducted a case study interview with a long-term user of the occult. So my subject for the case study had been practicing witchcraft for over 20 years at the time of our interview. And so I spoke to them about how they were introduced to the practice, where they got their information from, their experience with healing with witchcrafts, and their experience during the pandemic generally. For participant observation, the 3 videos that I ended up choosing were Magical Self-Care by a user named Harmony Nice, The Calm and Clear Healing Spell, a homemade salve recipe by the user The Green Witch, and Spell Jars for Beginner Witches, Money, Happiness, Healing, and Sleep by the user Natalia Anio. All 3 of these videos had over 50,000 views and over 250 comments. This was an engagement level that I felt I was comfortable with considering because it gave me a large enough sample size to feel confident that these videos were well received enough to consider accurate representation of videos targeted during the pandemic. So the first video consisted of practices I did expect to see, like meditation, breathing, spell work, a bath ritual. It was oriented around something that the user called unpleasant but necessary self-care. So it was oriented around mental and emotional healing first and foremost. The second video was oriented around mental and emotional healing as well, but it had a physical healing element to it as it was a physical salve that could be applied to physical injury. Then the third one had a broader view. Healing was merely a piece of the video, but I focused on the healing element to it. And this was a practice that I also slightly expected to see as it's a more beginning user practice of making a spell jar, which is a glass jar that you put elements into with specific intent to manifest, is the key word in the practice of witchcraft, an overall healing effect. So with all 3 of these videos in the comment section, they were very well received. Many of them had comments about how timely and necessary they were. And even in the Natalia Anio video, there was a comment saying that they used the spell jar for a parental figure and it actually worked to heal their illness. So many of these videos were well received and well practiced by large quantities of people during the time frame of the COVID-19 pandemic. As for the case study, I heard a lot of what I expected, but also things that I did not expect to hear. So my subject for the interview did detail that their first interactions with the occult were through online resources like social media and ebooks. They mentioned that the reason they leaned more so on online information was largely because they lived in a household that contained very strong religious convictions in the realm of Christianity. So they felt more comfortable practicing their pagan identity through online information. They also mentioned that they did use witchcraft as healing both before and during the pandemic, with what I mentioned before, lots of intentional breathing, meditation, and spell work for mental and emotional healing. They also mentioned during the COVID-19 pandemic, because they contracted the disease during the pandemic, they felt a lot of the effects that I mentioned before about a lack of accessibility to formal healthcare, and they used a lot of what they called chaos magic to counteract the uneasiness around not knowing when they could go back to work, when they were going to test negative, where they could access a testing site. They also mentioned, however, something that leads into my main takeaways from this research, which was they used witchcraft as a form of expression for their indigenous and queer identities. So my case study was on an individual who identified as both Native American and a part of the LGBTQ plus community. And so into the conclusions of this study, this helps enforce the fact that witchcraft and healing simultaneously are realms of free expression. These are places where interpretation can fully adapt to any pre-existing condition or ailment to the human experience, whether that is, again, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. Both witchcraft and healing individually can be applied to these, but together can allow for an expression to marginalized communities that can lead to healing from systemic oppression and religious trauma. Specifically, as I spoke to somebody who identified as Indigenous, they spoke on practices that have been appropriated by New Age paganism by non-Indigenous users that they feel that they can reclaim in a way by practicing them alongside non-Indigenous practitioners and heal from this idea that their practice was lesser than, or that they themselves were lesser than. And then on top of that, as a queer individual, they expressed that practicing witchcraft was a way to feel expression and belonging in a world where major religions tend to oppress and discriminate against those in the LGBTQ+ community. So the queer community tends to gravitate towards witchcraft for this reason. It's a place to escape from the nature of the Christian institution, to express themselves religiously and spiritually in a way that doesn't involve attaching themselves to that religious trauma. So overall, from this research and these conclusions that I didn't expect to come to, I ultimately have come to the understanding that witchcraft, along with healing, are forms of self-expression. You can use witchcraft to express anything that you feel like, and more so, you can use witchcraft to express any form of healing that you need. So I encourage anybody who is seeking a form of self-expression to use healing witchcraft in any way that they see fit. Because these forms of healing and expression allow for breathing room for marginalized communities and allow for those who are left out by the modern healthcare system to seek healing that they need. So overall, this was a study of understanding and a study of just getting to the bottom of what this phenomena actually means to those who practice it. And then these are some of the references that I used. I include the citations for the videos I used in my participant observation, as well as the previous studies done on ritual and spiritual healing. And that will be the conclusion of my presentation for now.
Thank you very much.